Hey there, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran living off the residuals from a successful dog food jingle in the early 90s, or a scrappy upstart with a garage band demo of your own Visions of Johanna-esque masterpiece just waiting to be discovered, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, I hope this episode finds you well. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who came out to our California shows this month. What a blast those shows, particularly San Francisco, were for me. Also thanks to Josh Ritter and his crew for those shows I got to open for them in the Midwest and in Colorado, particularly Boulder, which was a special night. Although I gotta say, you guys in Boulder, I'm all for the legal weed, and I partook, but right now you guys have a serious decorum problem. You can't be smoking it in the middle of the street like that, like a pack of animals. You got to be cool about it, at least until the rest of us get it, because right now you're blowing up the spot. So just relax with that. A good friend of mine who listens to the show recently suggested that I try a new segment next month where I field a question or two at the top of the show, and I'd like to at least try it, although I'm not sure if it'll work or not. So if you're a songwriter yourself who's starting out and wants to pick my brain, give me a shout. Or if you're the relative of an aspiring songwriter and you want to talk them out of it, I can help you with strategies to do that as well. Or if you just have questions about past episodes, happy to take those. Get a hold of me at either theworkingsongwriter@gmail.com or joepugmusic@gmail.com. If you've listened to the other episodes of this podcast so far and enjoyed them, or if in the first 2 minutes of this one I've already endeared you, the best way that you can help out is simply by rating the show in the iTunes store or within your podcast app. It's very quick. Within the app, you just search for the show, click on the reviews that have already been left, and then scroll to the bottom where it'll give you a chance to leave one of your own. As I've mentioned before, it'll help me out more than it will be a pain in the ass for you. So that's the simple math. Please take a chance to do that. My upcoming live calendar of shows is pretty sparse at the moment, but I've got some pretty big tour announcements coming up in the next month, so keep your eyes peeled, particularly if you live south of the equator. Okay, I think that's it. This month's episode, as you're about to hear, really gave me a chance to reflect on Chicago, the city that gave me my start. I only lived there for 5 or 6 years, but it really left its mark on me. It's still my favorite city in the country, hands down. It was a real pleasure to get a chance to reflect on some of the musical institutions in that city that mean a lot to me. Hope you enjoy. My guest today is a linchpin in Chicago's proud history of folk and country music. Robbie Fulks was born in York, Pennsylvania in 1963. He studied for a few years on a scholarship at Columbia University in New York before embarking to the second city in his early 20s. He got his start at the Old Town School of Folk Music, a Chicago institution that opened its doors in the late 1950s. Old Town was an outgrowth of the community of folk musicians who were playing on Studs Terkel's Wax Museum radio show and performing at the storied Gate of Horn nightclub. The Gate of Horn was a small listening room in the basement of the Rice Hotel that was operated by none other than Albert Grossman, the irascible music manager who would later shepherd Bob Dylan onto the national stage. In Chicago in the 1990s, a number of groups such as the Handsome Family, the Waco Brothers, and of course Wilco were discovering strains of country music that were off the beaten path of the genre's more polished standard bearers. Fulks became similarly inspired and with the help of producer Steve Albini recorded his cult classic debut, Country Love Songs, which featured both genuine homages to the style as well as wry parodies, including Rock Bottom Population 1, She Took a Lot of Pills and Died, and The Scrapple Song. Over the years, he has recorded for Bloodshot, Yep Rock, and Geffen Records. He's appeared on Prairie Home Companion, the Grand Ole Opry, and Austin City Limits. The New York Times has described his style as one part artful country, one part artful send-up of country, and one part everything else. The Guardian has dubbed him one of country music's true outsiders. We met, as would befit two working songwriters, at a Holiday Inn beside George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston. He was leaving town from a gig the preceding night, and I was just arriving for a show of my own. But before our ships passed in the night, we sat down to talk about his life and music. So, yeah, you were from Pennsylvania, but you moved around quite a bit when you were a kid because your dad was an academic. Was that the case, or a professor?
Yeah, that's putting it grandiosely, probably. But
Okay.
he was a assistant professor at University of Virginia for a little while, so he lived around there. And then he was a teacher at the sort of alternative hippy dippy high school where I went for a while, and then he was eventually principal of that high school. And then he sort of burned out on that, and he worked for the state for a while, and now he's retired.
Gotcha. And so at that hippy dippy high school, were you, what sort of music and books were you getting turned on to then?
Oh, I remember Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, and, it's like 70s time frame, so it's stuff that looks really, frankly, kind of crazy now. But Theodore Roszak and Philip Slater, and, anything that was kind of like, kind of had a radical hardcore edge to it, and was maybe kind of offensive in a way. I was kind of drawn to not just radical and shake things up and maybe anti-American. I was kind of into that kind of sociological writing back then.
Gotcha. And what music was giving voice to that for you at that time?
I don't know that music was so much, but I mean, Bob Dylan was my number one guy probably when I was a teenager. So obviously he has that. A little bit of that in his persona at depending what month it is.
Yes.
And but the politics and music maybe not as much. But I don't mean to. I shouldn't focus entirely on that. But also like literature, like Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow, and then comic stuff like Mad Magazine. So I wasn't quite as narrow a stripe as I just represented, probably.
Gotcha. But you ended up shipping off pretty early to go to Columbia University at about 17. You went up there and you were studying English?
Oh, you've done what Wikipedia?
Yeah, well, I'm just what I'd like to do here in this interview is I just would like to verbalize your Wikipedia page. No, I just kind of want to get a sense of. It's really interesting to me. I feel like playing music for a living, being a fellow that goes around taking songs to people. I feel like all of us have fallen into it in a different way. It's like you fall into the job, but I have found that with a lot of people, it's like your whole life was kind of leading to this one. There's tendencies to be artistic. There's tendencies to want to work for yourself and be a business owner. There's all of those things lead to one place. So I just kind of wanted to take it back a little bit and kind of understand when you went to Columbia, were you there you were studying English there? Or?
Presumably, yeah, nominally. And I didn't do too much while I was there. All I wanted to be was a musician, really, from the beginning. So I didn't think that I would get into Columbia, and I didn't apply anywhere else. And I was just assuming that I would kind of wander with my guitar for some years and make love to my girlfriend and just drop out of society and, do that. But anyway, I got in, and it was a free ride, and my folks said, no, you got to do this. And so I went up there and proved that I couldn't quite do it. So
Well, but
know.
you were doing other stuff. I mean, you were playing in the city at that time, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, academically, I wasn't really suited to that. But yeah, I played at Gertie's Folk City and Speakeasy and a little bit in that scene in the Village in the early 80s and up around Columbia a little bit. And never exactly got a toehold, but I loved living in the city, and I loved the way the city was back then. I mean, it was in a way, it was a crueler city. You know, there were more people sleeping on the streets and stuff like that, and more crackheads and, Times Square and all that. But it was also really, vibrant and sock you in the face, exciting.
Yeah. I mean, I remember going to visit an uncle in Manhattan who lived there. Even in the early 90s, there was like just a danger about that city. I remember it was palpable as a kid going up there that when I go to New York these days, anytime in the last 5 to 10 years, I feel none of that danger whatsoever. I feel like I could walk down any street at any given time, which is probably not the case, but it feels different.
Well, it's funny to be nostalgic for a time when, somebody could beat you over the head and, rape you and kill you, just by walking on the wrong street. But yeah, it was kind of exciting. And, just among other silly, commonplace memories, I remember literally the first trip I took away from campus when I was there, the September that I arrived at school, I saw that Tom Paley was playing in the Village, and I got on the subway, and then there was a fire on the subway, and we had to get off the subway. So we're hundreds of people are running out of the subway station, and we're in Times Square all of a sudden. And then I started walking down the street and looking at these theaters that are showing things like, chainsaw movies and Basket Case or whatever they were showing at the time. And then a guy fell into step with me and started talking to me about his life and stuff. And then he had some drugs, and then all this stuff just happened because I went off to see a folk singer play, in the Village. And so that was like sort of a typical outing of the time. Just strange adventures would befall you.
A lot of serendipity in that city. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny, that sort of describing a night like that, I feel like even now with phones, there's less of a chance for a night like that to happen. I just remember thinking back to my college days. I went to Carolina for a couple of years, and just getting lost all the time, like walking around a place like, I don't know where we are right now. And then you end up in somebody's house and end up drinking off a keg that you never would have.
That's true. My son went to, at the time he was, I think, just out of college, probably 22, and I was playing in the town, Champaign, where he went to college, and he came to hear me. I got totally drunk, and he was like riled up at the show, yelling bullshit, yelling, fuck this town, like all these things I didn't want to hear. He was yelling and just being obnoxious. And then he kind of wandered off into the city. I found this out the next day when I talked to him, and he blacked out, and he woke up on a street corner like 2 miles from the club where I was playing. And when I heard the story, like being as old as I am, I said, well, what the hell did you do when you came to and you didn't know where you were? And he said, I just looked at my phone and I went home like to find out where I was. It's a totally different orientation.
No, it really is.
You can't get lost.
I mean, I remember I had a scenario like that where I was in D.C., in the summer when I was about your son's age there, and got really drunk, got woken up by like the guy in the metro. It's just like, son, you're at the end of the line. You need to get out here. And I just didn't know. I had to go sleep in a bush because there weren't any taxis there yet. You know what I mean? I had no one to call. So I went and slept in a bush because I figured, well, the taxis will be here when the commuters are there. Yeah, well,
your memoir should be called "I Had to Go Sleep in a Bush."
I had to go sleep in a bush by Pug. God damn it! But you got out of New York shortly after you went straight to Chicago from there, right?
Well, no, I went. Yeah, I did. I'm sorry, I'm confused. Yeah, I went in 1983.
I got your story a lot more straight than
yes,
you got it.
You're doing better than Wikipedia or me, either one. I came to Chicago in '83 and got a job in a law firm for a couple of years, and
because you had a family at that point.
I had a family. Yeah, I was 20, and I had my first kid, and so I got a straight job to support them, and then I joined a bluegrass band not too long after that. And
yes, Special Consensus.
Special Consensus, yeah.
Yeah, out of. Now, they were kind of working out of, and you would begin to work at a very special place, Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. How did you fall in there?
Well, I started there in '84. I was working at a club called Hobson's Choice, which weird thing, but there was a folk singer, Bob Gibson, that maybe two of your listeners remember. He was kind of a big presence in the folk boom in the 60s. And he was a friend of mine and sort of I don't know, maybe a quasi-manager for about a minute. But he had a club. He started a club where his principle was that you would go play not for a night, but for a month. So if you were booked there, you would work every night, like for a month. And
how do the economics on that one work?
Exactly. I mean, for me, they worked great as a player. I'd walk down there. It was like a half a mile from my house, and I'd get off of work, grab my guitar, and walk down. And I didn't have an audience. I would open shows for Josh White or other people down there. But anyway, when you got hired for a month, and you had a job for a month, and the club, closed after a year and a half, and a bunch of investors got really angry at Bob, and I think there were lawsuits and stuff, but it was not destined to last. But it was some sort of strange 60s idealism of his that this is the way that it used to work in the old days, where you could roll into town and you didn't have to leave right away. And he just, the month idea, I don't know where that came from, but that's insane. Anyway, it was while I was working there, to make a long story even longer, that the guy from the Old Town School, Mike Miles, came and saw what I did and hired me, and I got to be fast friends with him and enjoyed working at the Old Town a lot. And over the years, just met a lot of people there as students and other teachers as well that are lifelong friendships. Yeah.
For people who don't know about it, the Old Town School in Chicago is not only a venue, which is a great venue, about 300 or 400 seat listening room, but it's also a school for music where people come in to learn songwriting, to learn instruments. It's also a music shop. It's a real hub for people that love this type of music, acoustic music. Did John Prine get his start there, or is he just a supporter of
I'm not clear on that, because he got his thing hit when he was pretty young, right? He was like 25.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how that figures into that.
And that would have been the 70s. Did him and Steve Goodman kind of cast a long shadow in the city at that point for folk music, or was
in the 80s?
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, in my mind, they still do, but maybe that's receded a little bit.
No, I think they still do.
Yeah, you'd always hear Earl of Old Town School, Prine, and Goodman in the same verbal chunk, and I'm not sure of the reality of the connections. And
did you ever meet Prine's now deceased manager, Al Bonetta?
Briefly, yeah.
Al was really...
People didn't like him.
I liked him, but yeah, I mean, I could see why. I could see how he would rub people the wrong way, but he had a couple classic lines very early on in my career. Someone at Prine's record label was like, "Hey, we want to sign you." So I was like, "Cool." We went down to Nashville, but Al, who owned it, had no idea who I was and had no real interest at all in working with anyone else besides John Prine.
This is at Oh Boy?
This is at Oh Boy Records. And so we go down, and he has like this hot rod collection that he shows me, and I'm driving around in a hot rod with Al, and he tells me that he said, before I met John, I was managing a roller skating chimpanzee, and I heard John Prine play Sam Stone, and the next day I fired the chimpanzee.
That's funny.
So this is the level he comes at. And he also had the classic line to me. He once said to me, "Joe, never trust anyone that says trust me. Unless they're saying trust me, I don't give a fuck."
That's awesome.
But that was... So I guess... Oh, well, I got...
That's true. But the amazing thing to me about this side of what we do, I mean, like, it's show business. It's just show business, and it's not what people think when they think of John Prine or Joe Pug or whatever. But it's the carny, old school, rip your throat out side. Yeah, I mean, the guy from Alligator is the same way. When you meet him, what's his name? Ken.
I don't know.
From Alligator Records in Chicago, but I'm just picking out one name. There are all these people. Like, my first response to Al Bonetta was like, "Oh yeah, everybody hates him." That's all you hear is like, he spit in my eye, he tore up my contract, he called my kid a fucker, whatever. These guys, but that's what undergirds this whole, even this gentle songwritery side of show business.
It really does.
it's kind of funny. It's one reason I love that movie Inside Llewyn Davis, because it really is more realistic than a lot of these music industry stories, and showing the surrealism of it, and showing the guy that didn't. Did you see that movie?
I did not see Llewyn Davis.
Oh man, people don't like that movie either. But it's what we're talking about is represented in that movie because the guys that wrote it, I guess, know what happened. You know.
It really, your life does get easier, or it gets more clear when you're working in this business, and you just realize, I mean, if you're at a certain level, if you're at the level where you're playing clubs, you're basically just like, my job is fundamentally to help these people sell booze, and that's why I get paid. And even last night we had a show canceled because of weather, and I found myself at one point not talking to a promoter, but literally talking to like a restaurant manager, and like them kind of explaining to me why it couldn't be moved indoors and it had to do because of the restaurant. And I'm like, man, I thought I was going into working in the arts, but really my job sometimes is, it's like hospitality industry. It can be kind of brass tacks in that way.
Right. Yeah. You don't think that you're a salesman maybe at first, but that's what you are. And I think on the other side of that equation, when the restaurant manager is looking at guys like us, you know, you get a certain amount of contempt from those people. Oh, here's the frickin' folk singer who thinks he's, you know, in the arts.
Well, you know,
get in the club, buddy, and shut the fuck up. And
I think it's always a very clear line of cause and effect. Like if you bring people, they're cool with you, and if you don't, they're not cool with you. And I remember talking to a promoter recently and thinking for a moment that we were buddies because we had worked together for 7 or 8 years. And I said, thanks for having me back, man. I really appreciate it. And he just, no emotion at all. It was just kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, as long as you're bringing people here, we'll have you back. It's just like with the clear implication that if you stop bringing people here, I'm not your friend, and I'm going to book somebody who will. And
what was it? Trust me.
Never trust. This is Al Bonetta's classic quote. Joe, never trust anyone who says trust me, unless they're saying trust me, I don't give a fuck.
Trust me, I don't give a fuck. Yeah. Trust me, I don't give a fuck about you as long as you keep bringing people in. Yeah.
Pretty much, man. I remember being in his office as he got a call from the Cubs. While I was in his office, he got a call from the Cubs, and they wanted a price. So he owned Steve Goodman's publishing as well. And Steve Goodman, obviously,
there's your hot rods, right?
That's where you get the hot rods from. And so that meant that Al Bonetta owns not only the song, but the phrase, "Go Cubs, go."
Wow.
So
the phrase.
The Cubs were calling him to price him out on how much a billboard would cost for them to put up with, like an old style billboard that said "Go Cubs, go." And he's in there with me. He goes, "What do you think, Joe? 50, 70K? What do you think I should charge for this billboard?" I haven't thought of this story since it happened, 7 or 8 years ago.
That's awesome.
Sometimes you have to blow it all up and try something new just to find out you had it right in the first place. Maybe it was like that for Robbie, who began making his records with the Please Don't Call Me a Producer, Steve Albini in Chicago in the 1980s. Robbie took a step away to try some different recording approaches, and then, for his 2 most recent releases, Gone Away Backwards and Upland Stories, came full circle with a return as Albini's client. Now, as a kid of the 90s, I was raised on Nirvana's Cult of Personality, and Albini, who produced their 1993 album In Utero, loomed large in my imagination. Who was this guy from the center of the commercially indifferent hardcore scene, recording the likes of the Jesus Lizard and Tad and Fugazi, who had drawn rock and roll's biggest stars into his orbit? Who was this guy that preferred to remain uncredited in the liner notes, or at most referred to as a recording engineer? Who refused to accept points or royalties on an album that has now gone on to sell some 15 million copies because, on a personal level, he found it ethically indefensible? Today, in a post-boom music economy, it often seems that any consideration beyond immediate transactional success is like a naive luxury. But that view is contradicted daily on Belmont Avenue in Chicago by Albini's Electrical Audio Studios. Their business practices have always centered around the punk ethos of equality and fairness rather than rate of return. And as legions of other studios have gone under, they're still afloat. He recently opined to a journalist, "If you start from the premise of refusing to be an asshole, then a lot of other decisions kind of make themselves." Personally, I have a soft spot for any Italian in rock and roll, and any punk whose last name ends in a vowel. So naturally, I was interested in this long-standing creative partnership of Robbie's. Bloodshot, which is a great label in Chicago, eventually got turned on to what you did, and your collaboration with them would eventually become Country Love Songs, which had been engineered by Steve Albini up there in Chicago. Had you been working with Steve before you had to deal with them, and what was...
Yeah, we met in 1986, and I went to his house and did some recordings. It was Halloween 1986, I actually remember the date, and we initiated a friendship at that point, and then the Bloodshot stuff is, what is that, like 7 years after that, mm-hmm. So that's a ways after we started hanging out. Yeah, sorry, what was the question?
The question was, so how did those songs that would become Country Love Songs, like, it sounds to me like you had just been doing recording with Steve and then you mm-hmm. culled those songs down to a record, or did you go in specifically to say, it's these 10 songs and we're
the
going?
Beginning of it was actually that first session in 1986. I recorded 6 songs, and one of them was a song called Cigarette State, and mm-hmm. So on the arduous and long, more than a decade-long process of trying to get in front of a label and trying to get my name on a record that wasn't owned by me, you know, mm-hmm. I heard about Bloodshot starting up, and they were doing a sampler, and I heard that they were going to include a version of Cigarette State that was done by a local band, a country mm-hmm. band in Chicago, and I said, I wrote to them and said, hey, I've got this version of me doing it. And I dropped Steve's name, and I said, it was engineer. And they said, oh, we'd definitely be interested in hearing that. And then they put that out. So after that first sampler came out, I had my foot in the door with Bloodshot, and I remember writing them a long sort of academic treatise kind of a letter where I asked them to, I was basically proposing my first record, Country Love Songs, with them, and I described what it would sound like and what the point of view would be and some of the players. And again, it would be through Steve, or partly through Steve, as it turned out. And so in bits and pieces, I started working on that record. And I guess their second sampler had She Took a Lot of Pills on it, and that came from another 3-song session at Steve's. So there were these little mini sessions of a couple of songs at Steve's and at the Skeleton Studio in Springfield. And then finally a big burst in 1995. I finished off the record with another 8 or 9 songs, and it came together out of those, 4 or 5 different sessions.
So it was about a 10-year process or close to it, to get...
I guess if you start from 1996, that's right.
1986,
yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't see it that way because that original 6-song session was just for... apart from all of this. And it was even before I really knew much about country music. It was before I was working professionally in music. It was before I was like totally in love with honky-tonk classic country music. So that was kind of a different chapter in my life. But like I said, providentially, just through that country band that covered it and through these other associations, it kind of eventually, led into the other thing.
It's interesting to hear you talk about trying so hard at that point to get your stuff in front of a label, because I think, especially what young songwriters who are coming out now, let's say in like their early 20s, wouldn't understand is you needed a platform at that time to release something. Now, I mean, there was no... It's hard for people now to understand that there was not an internet to speak of at that time to self-publish on.
Yeah.
And what a game changer that actually is, to be able to self-publish, because you had to search out a platform. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to release anything.
Yeah. I mean, it was easy in a way. Like understanding the process was easy. There are these A&R guys at labels, and you send them tapes. You know, I mean, that was my process for for 12 years, and it was just hard because the gate was so narrow, and it was hard to rise up and get attention. And it's hard, as you know, to like figure out how to use a studio and how to get good sounds onto tape. I mean, playing in front of a club audience or even an arena, whatever, doing a show is one thing that we can do, and we've done it time and again. But figuring out how to get sounds onto tape or whatever is a whole different thing. So nowadays, on the other side of the equation of then versus now, I personally, I just don't really understand. I don't have a mental handle on how groups rise up and get noticed now. But having kids, I know that it happens the same way. And my kids find out about music through YouTube and other means. I just don't know if I were starting now how I would go about getting my stuff noticed on YouTube, or how I would, go about making a name for myself. You probably know better than I do.
Man, I think we're all in the dark as far as how the fuck it works.
That's the end of the show. Okay.
Yeah, that's the end of the show. That's it. We're done.
We're sleeping in a bush, and we're all in the dark.
We're going to go sleep in some bushes now.
Wake up, Matt. Matt's had a hard morning. You probably did all the driving. No?
Matt recording us here is passed out on the hotel bed.
Yeah, totally drunk.
Totally drunk at 11 in the morning. You were saying that obviously we both, you play shows all the time. You understand how to do that, but getting good sounds in the studio and getting good stuff on tape is a different skill. What did you learn? What were you learning in that 10 years to help you do that? What were some of those skills to get a good recording that you learned through trial and error?
I would say really working with Steve was one of the most enlightening things about that happened to me when I was younger. Definitely that happened to me working in studios, because when you go to a guy's studio, as you know, you're in his place, you're at his mercy, and you're specifically at the mercy of his sense of values, his sense of what is good music, what is a good sound, what's a good mic, what's a good method. And Steve is a little bit of an anti-method guy. He strongly prefers, he's a strong philosophical, almost a moral philosophy behind the way that he works, and it amounts to taking a snapshot of a performance and not manipulating a group of sounds into a piece of recorded tape, but taking a snapshot of an event that happened. And that really influenced my thinking a lot about how to work in the studio. And I've tried different ways, and I like as a listener hearing a lot of different approaches to making records. But for me, that really tied into what works. It's helped me a lot because I understand how to get a group together and how to sit in a room and listen and make a good thing out of everybody playing at once. I don't exactly understand how Mutt Lange puts together a Def Leppard record. So I would rather go with that idea that it's a recording is a document of an event that happened, and pay attention in my mind to the event itself, how to shape the event and how to make a good live performance and perform it and have the recording be the performance.
So in your workflow, it's more important to set up. It's like you spend more time thinking about the group of people that would be involved.
Exactly. The casting is important, and the first 10 seconds of the performance are really important. What happens at the very beginning, because I think so much of your expectations and your opinions are set within the first 10 or so seconds of a song, or maybe of any piece of music. From Rite of Spring to Paradise by John Prine. The opening sounds are really crucial in setting the expectations. So anyway, that's just
as a listener, you're saying.
As a listener, right, right.
So when you cast that group of, you're aware of the group of people that you cast. You're aware of how you get into the song at the start of the recording, basically, to set that tone.
Yeah, and I get a picture of how I want the setup to be, maybe something about the mic placement, and then it's just chipping away at it after that. It's never as you plan it to be, even if you know pretty precisely how everybody approaches his instrument, things happen, as you know that. I keep saying, as you know,
No.
Things happen that you don't anticipate, and then you sort of flow with those, and it becomes something different. And then you listen to the playback, and that's not quite as you imagined it would be, and you work to that, and eventually it comes out to be some sort of a compromise between the mental plan that you had going in and what naturally wants to happen.
So you're kind of coming in with that group of people, being in a room with them, and then are you kind of quarterbacking the arrangement from there, saying, hey, for the second verse, A, B, and C, the solo that you took here, A, B, and C, or do you kind of cast people and then let them do what they do?
Probably more the first, but I think over the years, like I've been at it for 30 years or whatever, over the years I've tended more toward the second, where it's more or less laissez-faire and where my values are just kind of wider. And I think really I found that people are a little bit hard to direct, like even if they come into you open and directable and really wanting to do anything that you want them to do, to me, what they play the first time through, that's 90% of what it's going to be. And you're working with this little wedge of 10% to direct,
Man, you really hit the nail on the head in my experience with that. I think it's really interesting. I heard I heard Alec Baldwin talking about working with Woody Allen. And he said when you're on set, he didn't really give you any direction at all because he feels like if he needs to give you a bunch of direction, he cast you wrong.
Right.
And then there's that apocryphal story of him that for every film he does, he has a budget that's twice as much in case he casts the wrong person in a major role and has to do the film again. Because he's not going to come in and micromanage. It's such a more effective way choosing people that, that just have the skill set to get the job done. And you're right. Maybe that last 10%, you can say, well, for this project, let's use this part of your bag of tricks. But, man, that 90%, you're not going to change it in a 2-hour session.
Yeah, it can be dispiriting when you think about it, but it's just the way that it is. And what was I going to say about that? Yeah, you get personalities that come in, and often when you give a direction, it's really interesting just hearing the effects of direction. You say like, no, try this instead. You'll say, you avoid saying, giving line reading, so to speak. Play these notes, or you avoid saying, like do exactly this. But you'll say, pretend, you're Buddy Emmons in 1957, not the Buddy Emmons of the troubadour period of the early 60s, but Buddy Emmons in steel guitar jazz, and pretend, and be like that. And then you'll hear the person either sort of nail that or try to nail that, or to me, what I was going to say is a lot of times you can hear the person strive to do that, but you can hear them striving in the performance, and that you really should have gone with what they did in the first place as themselves. So a lot of times you just want to honor that 90% and make it fit into your thing rather than try to alter it.
I agree. Or just, move on. Like there's a certain point where so many times in the past working creatively, like I just wish when I came into the situation, I immediately saw like, this is probably not going to work. But then I just kept on, just not throwing good money behind bad at some point, just saying, guys, this isn't going to work.
Yeah, I've lost a fair amount of money from miscasting over the years. A lot of times. You do.
I mean, I go to shows all the time, and I fall in love with different musicians and different players. But I think as I've gotten older, it's been helpful to learn, like, hey, you can still really love the way that someone plays, and they don't necessarily fit with the project that you're doing right now. You can just appreciate them for what they are.
Right.
To juxtapose Steve's style and the style that we're kind of talking about right now, I'd really like to talk about in the late 90s, you were signed by Geffen Records, and you kind of pitched them with a almost like a rock sound for your album Let's Kill Saturday Night. And can you talk about the process of that record and how it was different from Steve's methods and the methods that we were just talking about?
Well, I had a really my vision of the record was both precise and imprecise. I wanted to deliver an all-around omnivorous kind of a record, and it had rock sounds in it, or whatever rock was to me then in the 90s. Crunchy electric guitars and sort of somewhere on the Matthew Sweet Graham Parker spectrum of songwriter rock. But then it also had honky tonk on it, and it also had some experimental-ish stuff on it, like the song Night Accident that was a little bit non-genre, long story with atmospheric sounds supporting the storyline. So it was kind of a stylistically ambiguous record, which is a constant idealism of mine to get past these markers, And so that's what I presented to them. It was difficult to find a producer, and they insisted on an outside producer, and they insisted that it not be Steve and that it not be Lou Whitney, the two people that I'd worked with on my first two records. So it was a little bit of an imposition, but I was. I wasn't that thrown. It was a challenge, just we got to find somebody, and who's it going to be? And it can't be over X amount of dollars. So it was very surprising to me. I remember hearing all these tapes from producers that would come in, and it was just really hard to figure out who was a good producer from these tapes, these reels that they would send. And the reels came from people like John Hampton and Jim Rondinelli and Jim, I can't remember his name now, Jim, the remix guy from L.A. Anyway, I listened to like 50 of these things. And the thing about producers of, fairly low-budget records is that they just sound like the band. So a lot of the bands kind of sucked. And whether the guy was using a good kind of a mic or whether the mix was interesting, it was just like swamped by the fact that the song is garbage and the band is not playing well. So it was hard to assess who was the right person. I eventually picked this guy. His name was John Keane, and he worked out of Athens, Georgia, in his house, in his studio. And part of the reason I picked him was I didn't really like his reel that he sent. I didn't like the way that things sounded. So much, and they didn't sound bad, but they didn't sound great to me. But I liked his personality over the phone, and he seemed like he was. He said, "Yeah, bring in whatever musicians you like. You're out there on the road. You know what musicians you like to play with." So it seemed like we could get a good working relationship with. And I thought, well, the technical stuff will work itself out. Well, that was totally wrong. The technical stuff didn't work itself out, and we had different values. And as soon as we got there, he said, take apart your guitar amp, let's put the head in the closet down the hall, let's put the cabinet down here, and let's sit you over here, and then he's looking at a computer, and I'm thinking, holy shit, I'm in the wrong place. And this totally ties into why I didn't really like the sounds that I was hearing on the thing. So we didn't see eye to eye, and working conditions got tense. And he ended up in the hospital with kidney stones.
Oh, my God.
He went away, and at that point, I packed up everything and also went away. But at this point, we'd spent like $50,000, I think. This is after 4 days. This is after bringing in Ben Folds and other guests from outside to work on the sessions. This is after a lot of energy and effort and money. And then back to square one again, really. Wow. Very weird... a trying situation. So at this point, I landed on the perfect producer, who was a guy called Rick Will, who was a friend of some friends of mine, Bill Lloyd and others in Nashville he had worked with. He'd worked with Gillian Welch, and he'd worked with Junior Brown, he'd worked with Johnny Cash, and then he had worked with Bobby Brown and Rhythm and Blues, and he'd worked with some metal guys. He was all over the place, So he was the perfect producer, and really interesting guy. High almost all the time, constantly smoking weed and wearing weird fuzzy shorts. In other words, he had a kind of a persona, and it was a little bit of an aloof with the intelligence, a strong intelligence hidden under 7 layers of kind of shtick and marijuana and Zen and this and that, like a kind of person that's the opposite of my personality in a lot of ways. But I got on with him great, and he had a great ear. One of the first things he told me to do, he pre-produced us for a couple days, and then he said, "Your band's terrible. They're awful. This is not working." And I said to the band, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but our producer," these are guys that worked with me on the road for like years.
Yeah.
And I said to them, "I'm sorry, the producer says I might have to fire you because you play like a bunch of 40-year-old bar musicians." And it was tough. And they looked at me seriously. And this is what we thought of that guy, basically reflected in the band's response to this. The band said, "Well, we've just got to up our game then. He's probably right. We were probably playing like our age and like our, we got to up our game."
Yeah.
And then they did. And then the record went on from there. So underneath all of this fuzziness that he had and the marijuana, he was like, he zoned in on shit really hard. And he could present harsh truths. And he lifted everything and made everything better. So despite the reputation that record has, it was really... for me, it was an accomplishment at the time. I was proud of it then. I don't know if I'd heard it now that I'd be as proud of it, but it was definitely the best I could do then.
When you own your own business, the grunt work doesn't take it out of you as much. I don't have a particular affinity for reconciling accounts at the end of the month, or staying at budget motels up by the airport, or tallying merchandise stock before and after shows. But when it's for the sake of keeping the lights on for my little business, for the sake of traveling around playing songs for people who want to hear them, I do it gladly. There's a couple clubs on the circuit I've played for the last decade that epitomize that joyful, owner-operated spirit, of which the Hideout in Chicago is uniquely emblematic. The building was built in the late 19th century. It's been an operating bar since 1934. Situated on the north branch of the Chicago River, in an industrial corner of the city that doesn't even have a proper neighborhood name. There's no reason for it to exist except that its owners and now its community have willed it to. Its owners for the last 20 years, Tim and Katie, have built a robust musical community, having hosted Nico Case, the Mekons, an early tour by the White Stripes, experimental forays by Jeff Tweedy and Company, free jazz pioneer Ken Vandermark, and yes, a residency by none other than Robbie Fulks. It's my invariable response when a friend who's planning a trip to Chicago asks for a can't-miss destination. And once they've been there, I'll use their impression of it as a litmus test for further friendship. Their own slogan describes it best. The Hideout is not your dad's bar, but your granddad's bar. It is the bar that Granddad went to when he was young and crazy. He did his best to hide that past from your dad, but you have found it. I talked to Robbie about the Hideout and other clubs it's been a joy for the two of us to work in. What year did you begin your residency at the Hideout in Chicago?
2010.
For someone who's never been to Chicago before, never been to the Hideout before, could you describe the Hideout in your own words?
It's a kind of it's an old shack built in 1920 or something, and
old.
Yeah, it's old, and it's it was an old man's bar for a lot of years. It's got a beer sign out front with not much to identify what it is. It's in a neighborhood that doesn't have a name, across from a fleet of city garbage trucks and other public utility vehicles. So it's a nowhere kind of a place, but the room is well dimensioned. It's a room that if you put 180 people in it, it's kind of packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, and uncomfortable. So it's small, it's squarish. The dimensions are good. There's a lot of wood in the room that, I don't know, it's a good room to do sound in. It's a good room that you can sit with a guitar and play into a mic and sound good in, and you can also rock out, if you're Cannibal Corpse, you can also sound good in there.
Yeah.
And, good size. And the staff are, I don't know what it is about the room specifically. I mean, the room isn't anything much to look at, but the staff, I think, is a lot of it. They hire cool people.
They really do. We, on the way walking up here to the hotel room, you and I were chatting about the Mucky Duck here in Houston, and also Fitzgerald's in Berwyn outside of Chicago, and how much we enjoy those places. And you're right, it's not the particular rooms. It really is kind of the esprit de corps that each one of those staffs has in their place.
Right. In Chicago, when you play there, you generally meet the people that own the club when you go to play there, I think. Mm-hmm. And in New York, when you go to play at a club, you don't, So so that connection is a little subtle, and I don't know if it adds up to as much as you might make it out to be, but it's something. It's something.
It is. It's like when you're in line. It's like when you're at a restaurant or a business of some kind and you realize the clerk waiting on you is the guy that owns the joint too. I mean, it's just a totally different. They have a different investment in the transaction you're having with them, meeting the owner of a club and working with them. When you're playing there, I mean, it completely changes the dynamic of, if you're just talking with a manager that's there for that night, that manager's purpose and his agenda is to make that club profitable that night, that month, that year. Mm-hmm. Owners have a totally different agenda, I feel like. I mean, it needs to be successful over a longer term. Maybe they're willing to invest in having you come in and not do too many people in their club. If they think 5 years from now you will, maybe it's just a longer view that they take with artists.
Maybe that's right. I'm thinking of contrarian examples now that we're talking about it.
Well, so
First Avenue in Minneapolis is like a thing like you're talking about. You go in, you meet the manager, and then the manager introduces the sound man. You never meet the people that own. Well, that's not exactly true. I've settled with the guy that owns it, I guess. But it's a corporation, and it's different layers. But people love that club, and I like playing at that club.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it can work. It can work that way. I mean, whatever way it is, it just has to be done with intelligence and skill, The other club that we talked about on the way here, Space in Evanston, is actually maybe a nice middle ground between these two models because why? Because it's not a franchise, but it's a little bit run like a franchise. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? You get in there and you meet the sound guy and you meet the manager. But they pay you well is what I was thinking. The pay is fair, and the pay can be if you do well there, you're permitted a strong stake in your financial performance.
Yes.
It'll be reflected in your paycheck.
Yes,
which isn't unfortunately generally the case at these places we're talking about, the House of Blues and the City Winery. You can. You get your guarantee, and then if you do spectacularly, it's not often reflected in the pay.
No, totally. You've kind of come back several ways artistically over the last 5 years, because with your last two albums, you've been working with Steve Albini again, and you've been putting them out with Bloodshot again, or are they just putting out your Boondoggle imprint?
No, it's I have a deal with Bloodshot, so it's full-on Bloodshot now. Yeah.
Okay, full-on Bloodshot. And your last two records have been... I've gotten a great chance to dig into your catalog over the last couple of weeks. It's what's so nice about doing this show is I have like a real excuse to be like, no, I can't do that right now. I'm spending this afternoon like digging deep into the catalog. And your last two records are my favorite of yours, and they're really.
Thank you. Mine too.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that you feel the same. It's cool for me as a writer to look at you, and you've been doing it for a couple decades now, and I'm like, cool. From my opinion, it's like, cool, well, you're hitting your stride like now, which that is very encouraging for me to look forward and see. Do you feel that way, that you're hitting a sort of stride in the last 5 to 6 years, writing-wise? And
I feel like I can't regain the innocence of like my first record. I've heard that from other like performers and writers too. And that innocent thing is really like a valuable component, and you can simulate it at age 50 or whatever, but I can't really recreate it. So that's missing. But that said, I feel like I've striven to get better through the years, and so I don't feel like the last two records are a sudden jump up and the rest is way down here on level one. But I feel like I've kind of striven uphill over the years, and that there's been a general curve, I think, from my first to my last record in terms of the lyric sophistication, the harmonic sophistication. I mean, the sophistication is something that you can attend to and improve as you go over the years. As the innocence gets lost, you can compensate in certain ways, I think. So,
what do you think is advantageous about Innocence in that first record?
I don't know. People react to it. Like people can tell that you're young and you're in love for some reason. The way you write when you're 30 and stuff, and the metabolism of the writer gets reflected somehow, I think, in the lyric and in some of the mistakes that you make, and the deficiencies of the music. They're transparent as well. And so, I think listeners can tell amazingly small things about who you are, from the music. It's kind of dismaying in a sense, but they can tell.
I agree. And I think they might not be able to articulate or verbalize what they can tell. They just verbalize it as saying like, yeah, I like that guy. Or, no, I don't like that guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. It's like it's like the way that like a dog can smell fear or something like that. People, I love what you just said about people can tell when you're in love, and there is something about that first record where you are, it's like a document of you falling in love with art, with music. That's
exactly right. Yeah.
It's very intoxicating.
It's a record about love for country music. And the new records are, obviously I still like country music, but the new records are who I am now, I guess. And I don't conceive them that way when I set out to write the songs,
Right.
It's about my journey and who I am now. But yeah, you can tell that now that I'm a certain age and that there's more behind me than ahead, and that I'm reflecting on, what kind of lives my children are going to have as they come of age, and what I'm seeing as I travel around, and that kind of thing.
You mentioned for a moment there that there's ways to not manufacture, but kind of fool yourself into that innocence as you get older. What are some methods that you have for kind of reproducing that?
I try to stay excited about music. I shouldn't even say try, but just the knowledge that there are neurological pathways that get closed as you age. Just knowing that, for me, automatically leads me to counteract it, with attitude. So that's happening in my head. Mm-hmm. So now I know that I have to listen a little bit harder and remember that, all the good music didn't happen in 1972 or some magical year.
Right.
It's still happening. So I still get excited about new music that I hear, and I try to balance, the older acts that I grew up with that I love, with the knowledge that there's good new stuff happening, and try to pay a little bit of attention to it. And so groove and musical excitement are what keeps me keep me in the game.
Is that from listening to other stuff? Is that from picking up different instruments? Are there?
It's from people that I play with too, because I play with a
Yes.
lot of different people now. And so, like this week, I'm out with a trio of these guys. Next week, I'm out with a slightly different trio. Week after that, I'm out with a slightly different. So it changes up so much, and I love to hear what great players. I love to communicate with them on stage, and that really keeps me avidly interested. And I don't know. In recent years, I bought a banjo and a mandolin, so I'm trying to keep it happening on different instruments and learn new techniques instrumentally too. So all that stuff keeps me happy.
That can be great for writing too, because you start when you play another instrument, chords are necessarily voiced differently, and you just
Right.
start hearing different melodies.
That's right. Yeah, you can really tell guys that spend 30 years writing out of the keys of A, E, and G on the guitar, right? It's just like, it's obnoxious after a while.
There's certain
Nobody
ways that
needs
songs
any more
start.
of that.
Yeah, the song will start in that certain way, and I'll just be like, fuck, I can't listen to this right now.
Yeah.
But then again, you run into
It was violent.
then you run into the problem where
How were your levels on that? Did
the
that peak?
levels got blown out by that fuck right there. Or, but it can reach my wife just yelled at me the other day because she was like, you keep on trying to buy all these different pianos and bring them into the house. You don't even really play piano. God damn it. You're right.
You're buying pianos. That's ambitious.
Well, you can get them for free off Craigslist. So it's, although I'm going to let you go here. I know you got to get to your gig, but I'm buying it's the only piano I've ever paid money for. It's a Wurlitzer Tom Thumb piano. Have you heard of this?
No, I don't know that.
They built them in the 30s as basically for the traveling salesman. And so they're like little spinets that are about the quarter size of a piano, but they're traveling. And so
What do they sound like?
it sounds good. It sounds like if you open up the soundboard, it sounds like a regular. It's a shorter scale, obviously, but I'm not a real piano player anyway. So like the bottom quarter and the top quarter of a piano, I'm never playing anyway. And this little thing is magical. This guy refurbished it and has had it up on Craigslist for the last month. I've been lusting over it. And
So you plug it in?
it's an acoustic piano.
Oh, okay.
It's an acoustic piano.
And you can travel with it. You take it on the road?
That remains to be seen.
Yeah. Is it heavy?
No, you can travel with it in the sense that it's not that heavy. 2 people can move it. It's going to be interesting to see how it holds a tune or not.
Uh-huh.
But at the very least, it'll be a smaller piano in the house, and I'll get rid of my other one.
That sounds really cool. Tom Thumb.
Tom Thumb piano.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to end the interview talking about me, man.
Not just a sexual fetish anymore, but an actual Wurlitzer that you can travel with.
Tom
Thumb.
Tom Thumb. There you go. Thanks for spending some time with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I
Thanks
really
for
appreciate
the
it.
different set of questions than one is used to.
Yeah,
Appreciate
man.
it.
Well, we try not to ask where do you get your ideas from questions here too much.
No, I wanted to answer that one. God damn it. That'll be the next one.
Drugs. That's right. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. That's our show for this month. Thanks so much for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, if you enjoyed the episode, the best way to express that affection is through rating in the iTunes store or through your podcast app this show. Thanks, of course, to Robbie. Thanks to Mike Sosin and Josh Zanger at Bloodshot Records for making this interview possible. This episode was engineered and mixed by Matt Schusler. If before we meet again you sit down to write, remember, an expensive microphone is not a song, our record deal is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.